I wanted to make a follow-up video. Just reading the second half of the essay that I was reading. It's Heidegger and the Grounds of Redemption by Laurence Hemming. And it's from this book called Radical Orthodoxy. It's a collection of essays edited by John Milbank. I just got a new microphone, so I'm hoping that that helps with some audio issues that I have been having. So I hope I sound a little bit more clear. And so, as you can see, this section is going to have a lot of Greek words in it. Heidegger relied heavily on Greek. So I'm hoping that we can get through this okay. Just bear with me. I'm kind of learning Greek as I go. So anyways, just be patient, be kind. If Michael Gillespie is correct, and nihilism is what comes about in response to the need to establish the self, my I, in the face of an omnipotent and so potentially capricious God, then nihilism is itself a very way of being towards God, as being apart, and the unfolding of nihilism as a history, specifically the history of subjectivity, bears within it the trace of this being with. It also has the structure of a conversation. So recalling how at the beginning of this essay I suggested that faithfulness is a way of being, it now becomes possible to say the same of nihilism. In other words, both nihilism and faithfulness belong to ways of being towards, being with, being apart from other beings and God. If we can name nihilism and Christian faithfulness as standing opposed, then we can also begin to see the way in which we can speak of them as belonging together. This is speaking of them both in a historical unfolding of something, which has intimately to do with God. To ask this returns us to the question with which we began, which is how we might faithfully speak of God when we also speak of being in nihilism. So there's a prior question here. How can we better understand speaking, which we might paraphrase to ask, what is the power of the speech? The question of how speaking and being belong together is one that concerned Heidegger from the beginning, and certainly is a prime motor for the writing of Being in Time. So Heidegger returns to the dictum of Parmenides, which is to gar afto yoi sti ioti te kai inai. Being is said in many ways, or this is why it is what it is. So Heidegger's interpretation of this saying is that to speak of a being is to speak of it in the being of its being. To speak of a being brings it to light in a particular way, as what it is. This speaking is that speaking to oneself that occurs in the laying out and producing of a thing, a being, that selects this way and not that way, hence a deciding and producing that includes within itself the other ways of speaking in their concealment, i.e. as the unsaid in any given being, because the same being could be said in different ways. There's always in speaking then a deciding or a selecting. So speaking is therefore in itself a dividedness, and at the same time a finitude, in the sense of the producing perceiving of a thing in its how, as a this thing rather than a that thing, and as a finite thing. So logos also belongs to being ensouled, which is also psychon or animated, which means it belongs to human being. This means simply that speaking of a being in its being implies that there is one who here speaks, even if only to her or himself. So logos is not only the how of making a thing or a being present, but also the how of making a soul present at the very same time as the coming about and making present of a thing. So speaking then in this sense, comportment, the how or mood of how I and a thing come about futurally, Heidegger claims this is exactly Aquinas' notion of ensoulment. In Heidegger's 1931 investigation of logos, he simultaneously investigated the term archai, which we are apt to translate as origin. So in order to show how the horizon of time is also at work in all this coming about. This has a bearing on how I spoke at the beginning of how I am the horizon of God's coming about in the world in faith. For Heidegger, archai belongs to logos, not as its origin or what lies behind and so causes, but its end. So what I'm trying to get to, what lies ahead of me, it is then it is then a projection, the striving after the thing in its being produced, the erekton, or projection of what is to be produced here, making known of the outward appearance. How, therefore, did archai, as the projected out towards and so named and known, become understood as origin, and so later as cause? It is not possible here to do anything more than sketch Heidegger's argument in the briefest terms. So the archai of logos is ousia, which comes to be named as substance. But ousia thought in this way does not mean substance at all, but the here brought forward, produced, and known. So what occurs in consequence of speaking, even the speaking of myself, the dragged out from what is ahead of me, not presence, but the presencing, as that which is brought into presence, into being. Heidegger does not make this explicit in 1931, but later shows, with respect to Aristotle's understanding of physis, that, or nature, that in the two meanings of ousia, becoming present and being present takes over and dominates, so that being present becomes that which always already underlies. Later becoming epoche mivu, or subject, and substantia are as the underlying substance and therefore ground. Thus grounding becomes being caused. So substance as such then becomes the being caused of all and any given being. So all of this is in consequence of speaking, as a speaking to myself, that knowing is. So Western thinking names the relation to being of beings in a reversal, where the being present of things takes over and masters their how of becoming present in logos, where the I speaking that produces disappears in favor of the already present of any given being in itself. So this reversal determines an outcome for human being and also for God. In this reversal, the I that speaks in producing disappears in favor of something else, and so loses its determination to logos, yet it also retains the trace of its origin, understood no longer as the Greek experience of logos, but rather as relation. So how is this? Heidegger never makes this entirely explicit, but it is clear that it was his thinking of God that entirely governed his critique. So if I am no longer the being that has and holds myself in logos, setting aside for now Heidegger's question, in what way does logos have me and hold me in itself, then I am no longer that being whose being it is to come across and speak of the being of beings in their being. But rather I discover beings as already founded, as already being present, in a sense as already spoken, but with the meaning of this already spoken having been covered up to be thought of as origin and being caused. So put another way, the real is not something I produce in speaking, but into which I enter as already there, already other than me, and so from where I am already displaced. So to discover this real as already there conceals the meaning of my existence, Dasein, in favor of understanding myself as that one who has to account for the origin of what I find, because I do not participate in originating it. These beings in their already being present. So such a thinking retains within it the trace of the being of beings and their being known, precisely because in being already spoken, which means now originated and caused, a soul is implied, an originator or even a first cause. So moreover, I am transformed from one who reaches into the future in order to speak, even to myself, of beings and bring them here now, in their being, into one who must reach into the past for the origin and primary cause of everything that is, as something extraneous to me. So if I do not discover myself as that being who brings forth and gives these beings to be discovered in the being of their being, futurally, then because being is the same as being known, there must be some other I for whom this has already occurred previously. Such an I must be that I who precedes every other I and explains the origin of I being as such overall. The I being of the God of metaphysics. So this is the basis for Heidegger's claim that knowing is transcending, and that in metaphysics, transcending, understood in this way, disappeared in favor of the already transcendent God. So God, thought in metaphysics, is therefore the trace of my I, its universalization. Again, for this reason, the God of metaphysics, who is no more than human transcendence or an anthropomorphism, can never be the God of faith. The God of metaphysics is therefore that being who precedes, founds, universalizes, and omnitemporalizes every possible being in time that my I might ever be, ends, but only as ends infinitum. God is given in metaphysics, but nothing other than a projected and transcendent I, myself reflected back as wholly other than me. So nihilism proclaims this I dead and so open to question. The I that is this reflection becomes questionable in and as nihilism. As I become questionable in nihilism, which means as I enter the question, God as the universal I is no longer transcendent being, but dead in favor of something else transcending. So Heidegger understands transcendence as a speaking of the being of beings. The speaking of the being of beings means different things in the history of being. Thought by Aristotle and Plato, the speaking of the being of beings means the relationship leading from the changeable being to a being in repose. Transcendence, finally, is that highest being itself, which can then also be called being. Transcendence here, therefore, means being in general, thought as God beings determined out of prior, thus causal being, universality sought in a higher meta, uber, and trans sphere. Here, speaking means transcending into universality, transcendence experienced and thought of as the being of beings in metaphysics. There is another way of understanding that for Heidegger, perceiving and knowing as striving towards, again, or recton, described earlier, are all that it means to transcend. In other words, knowing, speaking, and transcending are all different ways of understanding the same thing, the human being, das Sein, in its being, das Sein. It is for this reason that human freedom is transcending into nothing. If God is dead, das Sein, Ichheit, and egoity, I find myself as that being which transcends in order to be, and which transcends into nothing, which is the mark of my finitude and the finitude of being, which means I, as questionable, am questioned, and that my being questioned brings me before myself as myself for the first time. Questioning is in this sense no different from transcending, which means that knowing and speaking, even to myself, are reconnected as two aspects of the same thing, my I. All of this is also part of the conversation of das Sein with the whole history of philosophy. This is a conversation of the human being with her and himself, that speaking to oneself, for which Heidegger characterizes logos, or what he elsewhere calls the worlding of world. When transcendence ceases to mean highest being for Heidegger, and comes to mean the finitude of being as transcending in nothing, then what nothing is comes to be heard for the first time. When I come into the question, I can ask aloud, who now is God? This question is above all mine, a question in consequence of my becoming das Sein, not as an object, but as self-existing. What is the force of this critique? What might theology be in consequence of nihilism understood in this way? In the first instance, it becomes possible to rethink the spatiality and temporality of faith, which is to say, something which takes place as worlded, mooded, and in modes of being human, as a life of faith. What is at issue here is that the analytic is always mine, and it is continuing, if I may encompass growth or estrangement, depth or disengagement. It is a way of having my time. In this sense, it is the way in which I appropriate myself as experiencing, as comporting or relating to the world. I am as this comporting belongs always and immediately to the given in comportment of world. God, as one of the things possible to be given in comportment, is separate from my I am as comporting only in one sense, because I am already there in the given in comporting. It is only in the sense that I, as my phenomenological self-holding, lie prior or apart from what is to be given or is atheistic. It is atheistic only in the sense that I do not experience myself as God, though when I experience God in prayer and sacrament and preaching, only some of the modes of being like Christ, It is I who have this experience, and therefore I am also given in the experience. God comes to me as a way of making me who I am. As I speak in a godly way, God comes to me as me, with me, and revealed in me. The difficulty of making sense of this lies particularly in how arche, or beginning, is to be understood as futural. So Kant's struggle in the opus posthumum had been in part to discover the inner unity and ground of God, human being, and world. This conceives the world as already there, already grounded, as arche, as the prior, what lies behind me. If, however, world is conceived as what comes from out of the future to me, so that I am determined from out of the future, and this futural eventing is structured by my being with that might otherwise be named as logos, then the problem of the groundedness of the world is independent from me and prior, or its groundedness is only in consequence of me, the will to power, disappears because the world never comes to me as an object or domain of objects except where I extract myself from it in that metaphysics that carries out the subject-object distinction. So again, arche is then always what lies before me, never what founds me. In this sense, the world and even the past always lies ahead of me as regions into which I enter, but I enter them because I am constitutive for them. I make them, I co-create them with the others whom speaking always presupposes. The question is not whether, but how. The how of my co-creating will disclose who I am. Who I am reveals me to be a conversation, one which takes place in creation, which means in creating with God. I am when I am in God in this sense, always prayerful. What underlies this must be the recognition that there can be no experience of God except in insofar as God meets with me in the realm of being. In this sense, all theological discourse is both a discourse concerning faith and already revealed theology. Still more important, any claims to a purely private or personal experience of God apart from world are shown to be nonsensical. This does not mean I cannot pray privately. It means that even when I pray on my own, in the privacy of my room, I pray in a world as a being whose coming about is as lingual or even logost. I pray as a worlded being, never in some interior subjective or noumenal sense. I pray as already related, already in being, already in the manifold saying of being. So insofar means existential, as a being who, having my being, experiences it as different modes, directedness, and so forth. Here the sacramental is then that mode of being which reveals me to be already related ecclesially, as one to whom God is revealed by the divine revealing aspect of world, perhaps here recalling Die Göttlichen as one aspect of the fourfold mirror play of Heidegger's later work. In this essay, nothing is decided for faithfulness, which is to say that the content of faithfulness cannot be given by an investigation into being, but only as a revelation. So what has been carried through here as merely an outline is what in other terms might be called an anthropology, although I hesitate to use the term. Being decides nothing for God, and yet is simultaneously intimately involved in God. Considered still more strictly, the being of God, or God's existence, is human being. God insofar as God meets with us in the realm of being in creation. The essence of God lies beyond what can be said or what can be spoken about. The only possible fulfillment of what is said here is a fully worked out Christology. The difficulties for theology to think these things through have partly been in consequence of a lack of clarity in the distinction made between so-called natural and revealed theology, an overdetermination of the relationship between God and God's creation, the realm of finite being. The problem partly comes to light if I consider that no one who claims to be an atheist ever carries out a natural theology, which is then subsequently shown to be propedeutic to a Christian revealed theology. Every natural theologian is already working from out of a situation of faith. So, what is going on? The construction of a natural theology is intended to explain how conversion is possible. In other words, it is intended to do two things. So, one, to protect the freedom of anyone not or not yet gripped by the truth of the gospel, and two, to explain who I am prior to my being taken up in Christ. It is in this sense carried out as a theoretical project subsequent to my being Christian. It articulates my separateness from God as an already belonging. It becomes problematized at precisely that point when it appeals to a universal time as opposed to being understood to unfold in the time of any given human being or Dasein. The word natural can now, in consequence of Nietzsche, be understood only as the constructed, to the extent that it is arguably no longer possible or even desirable that the word natural can be used uncritically to articulate the pious expression of faith. Construed in one way, natural theology is no different from claiming that nihilism is a normal state of affairs. Nihilism is that situation from out of which I am called to redemption. It is the experience of world apart from God. Understood like this, nihilism is that place from out of which I come and into which I fall in the continuing desire to be faithful, the continuing need to redeem the place in which I find myself. Ethics, then, is shown to have no ground apart from revealed theology, because ethics, as godless, is only that which is of God and falls out into nihilism. There is no grammatological necessity to a moral life, which is why ethics apart from redemption is always revealed to be in consequence of the will to power. It is always a self-founding, the only question being who is the self who, in demanding I am in certain way, is founding himself or herself. So it is necessary to note for a moment how negative theology might be understood. If negative theology is understood as in some sense disclosive of the essence of God, if, in other words, it has the pretension to be a philosophical discourse, which is in some sense totalizing, and more totalizing than positive theology because it already includes it, if, in other words, it conforms to Jean-Luc Marianne's understanding of negative theology as idolatrous, then negative theology is simply a vaster metaphysic. If, however, negative theology is understood fundamentally as my prayerful comportment towards a God of whom one may not speak, a way of being in the direction of God that does not seek to comprehend or dominate God's essence, then it might make sense. It is in this sense that pseudo-Dionysus means the negative, knowing as unknowing, being as beyond being, in which Eckhart is also groping towards, in, for instance, the sermon Quasi Stella Matutina, where language is subverted into a speaking, which is unspeaking, silence, not as the never said, but as the beyond said, which provides for saying. There are no more than outlines. These are no more than outlines, and moreover, they indicate a theology not at all out of step with much that has been and is being said already, sometimes in a surprisingly orthodox voice. In conclusion, a sacramental theology with a strong emphasis on the symbolic as disclosive, where I am determined faithfully from out of the future, is not in the least bit ruled out by taking seriously nihilism's claims about God, faith, and theology. On the contrary, taking nihilism seriously means being able to turn into the modern situation of nihilism and proclaim there the redemption in Christ, which is to be proclaimed and faithfully kept. So one might ask, what does it mean to bear God in my life? Which means as I come about in the worlding of world, to find God worlding with me, and so speaking and revealing God with and as me. Okay, I thought that was really good. It was a very difficult read. I encourage you again to pick up a copy of Radical Orthodoxy, again, a collection of essays that sort of situate theology alongside sites of secularism. It's very interesting to read. Thanks so much for listening. And yeah, again, sorry for shaky pronunciation here. This is a learning process. So thanks for listening and have a great day.